and how God had caused the light to be formed, and that he had called the light good, that this light was an incandescent light, a radiant energy of some sort. Exactly how it works, we don't know. We can speculate on a number of ideas, but we don't know exactly. We talked about the definition of the day, and again, found that there was a fair amount of discussion among commentators about what is the length of the day, as it's discussed here, with some holding that it was a strict 24-hour period, others holding that it is a longer or an indefinite time, and we'll see some more of that today. So, that issue really isn't gone. It just depends on really kind of who you reference on it, and what you might think what conclusion you might personally come to, really. But now we get into God has created the heavens and the earth. God has created the light. And now in verse 6, God says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. The word that's translated there as expanse literally means stretched out. The King James Version renders it as firmament, which probably is not that good of a translation given modern English, because firmament suggests solidity. And whereas this word doesn't really support that idea of solidity. It means an expanse. It means an expanded or stretched out section of something. And so the modern translations will all render that word as being expanse. And you'll see that in all these modern translations. And we understand we are moving from sort of God's viewpoint to a terrestrial viewpoint. Some commentators, and I'll let you go exploring if you care to do so. But some commentators have suggested that what is called an accommodative theory, and that is that God chose to explain Genesis to Moses using language and using concepts that man could understand at excuse me, at really all ages of his of development, of knowledge. That God does not give terminology. God does not use language that is meant to confuse or to obscure what actually happened. But neither does he go into great detail regarding what happened. Because of depending on man's capacity to understand it. Not sure I actually agree with that terribly. I don't think that, from my point of view, I'm wondering if it was, if it was the idea that God wanted to explain it, but doesn't, the details of it were not central to his purpose. And since the details were not central to his purpose, he gave explanation, but without giving the details, simply to ultimately put the sequence in its order leading up to the creation of man, and does so for that reason, because man becomes then his culminating effort of creation. And so to to try and argue that somehow the language has been stilted is a little I don't know, a little self-serving, I think, in some degree. But the point here is that now we have this viewpoint of seeing the expanse, and we're talking in this expanse of the sky and of the space beyond. This is still talking about the physical world. It is that realm of space that includes the planets, the galaxy, the planets, the stars, the galaxy, the sun, the solar system, etc., all described there. But we get into some of the questions of the text. It says, you know, here is, let's separate the waters from the waters. What does that mean? And in verse 7, God separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And again, what does that mean? What are these separation of waters? A number of possibilities here. One is that some commentators suggest that here were water, the physical water or a liquid water, and the formation of liquid water or the condensation of liquid water, and then there was this sort of an atmospheric water in the form of a fairly heavy fog or mist that covers the earth. Some even commentators would go so far as to suggest that there was a sort of like an ice dome over the earth in some way, at the reaches of the atmosphere, that there was actually a dome of water there at one time, and that dome of water, that dome of ice, was then a part of what then produced the flood. So you can find various commentators that'll take various positions on what this means. But several of them tend to agree that there seems to have been some sense that there is the liquid water, of course, that we're familiar with, the oceans and so forth, and then this water then that is in the expanse, and whether this constitutes some great fog or some ice dome or some other water, we're not 100% sure, obviously, but there is this separation. Other commentators, though, will look at this word for waters and suggest that it can be also translated as fluids, and therefore it represents not water in the way we think of water, H2O, but rather that it constitutes any kind of fluid, and that therefore there are these gaseous matter that is flowing around out, especially out in the solar system, and that there is this, even as the Earth is undergoing a formation process, that all the planets and the stars and the sun is undergoing a condensation process, and so there is this flowing of these matter into these various components of what we know as the physical universe and of the solar system, and etc. So, to my mind, it almost depends on how much these fellows, especially the commentators, are wanting to kind of bend themselves to kind of match the popular science of today, or how much, or what other kind of viewpoint they may have. I tend to favor the idea that from what I'm reading, that there is this idea of like ice or something like that, ice or water, within the atmosphere of the Earth, and that ice or water has an effect of being a source of water then for the Earth, but then in addition, it tends to diffuse the light, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. The next verse is then verse 9. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them on the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a third day. The formation of the seas here could be referring to any body of water. We would understand, of course, oceans, but any of the great bodies of water that we might understand as the earth forms and dry land is lifting up out of the water as the water collects at lower levels. And so we see that sort of natural process going on. And as God then creates the plants, and we begin to see the plant life appear, it simply confirms what we already know through science, that plants have to have an atmosphere. Just as human beings or animals have to have atmosphere, so too plants have to have atmosphere. And so a confirmation of what we already know, or what we do know, there is an argument now that about this, here's the plants, and the thought is, well, you can't, here's the sun formed the next day and so forth. Here's a counter argument. I'll give you this counter argument. I'm not sure that I subscribe to it, but I'll give it to you so that you know what some of the points and counterpoints are about this section of the text. And here is the idea, is that at this point, the sun and the moon and the stars, they all exist. They all exist. Now, they're not in their final form and they're not in their final place, but they exist because they were created according to this particular line of argument. They were created back here in verse 1. They were created. And so here there is a source of light. We know there is a source of light because we've seen that in verse 2, or I'm sorry, in verse 3 rather. There is a source of light. And so there is light coming upon, and there is light and darkness. And so again, that the sun and the moon already exist, but that what is happening is that the light is being diffused because of this, either the water vapor or the ice, whatever it is in the atmosphere, is diffusing the light. And so it's sort of the idea of, to an observer on Earth, it would be as if you were inside some kind of a frosted glass bowl or something like that. If you can imagine being inside some kind of a structure with the glass is kind of heavily frosted in some way. Well, it'd be like, if you left your car out overnight on a cold day and you get frost on the windshield and you try and drive with the frost on the windshield. Well, yeah, you can see light coming through, but you can't see any detail, and that light gets diffused pretty quickly. And so the argument is that the plants had light. They had light from the sun, which was yet not in its position, but was still forming. But there was light from the sun, is the argument. This is, again, the theory or an argument that goes, a line of reasoning. And again, I'll emphasize I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but I wanted you to hear it because you may run across it in some other study. And so what would happen is, though, as the Earth, whatever it was doing, if it was already beginning to rotate, we don't know. But at any rate, there was periods of light and dark, and that was apparent. And so all of this then combined to allow the plants to begin to grow. The plant life, we notice, it's we got the plant life of grass, herbs, and fruit trees. And again, we would notice if you look at the creation as they are classified. Here is plants that are identified as grasses, plants that are identified as herbs, and plants that are identified as fruit trees. All of them with a with a usefulness to mankind. There's always, in each one of these creations, in each one of the creations you'll see, there is sort of a differentiation between those things that God has created that are good, it's all good, he says, but some things have a particular focus for the benefit of mankind. And so we see the fruit trees coming into existence, and we see that the fruit trees, by the way, are coming into existence with fruit, with seeds in the fruit. And so some of we'll get into perhaps if you've seen the argument later on of, when Adam was he created as a child? Was he created as a man? Well, we understand him to be created as a man, full grown. And here he was, full grown, with the appearance of having been around for maybe many years, but in fact, he's just created. Same way with these trees. We understand the trees here are created with, full grown, with fruit, bearing fruit. Even though they are just created, they are there in full capacity, as it were. We also know that each one is producing after its own kind, or after its kind. The plants are not said to, move from one form to another, from one species or one type to another, but rather that they are of one kind. And we understand that while it is possible to change the characteristics of a particular line of plants, most of us have seen horticulture work that's been done to improve the quality of plants, get more produce out of a particular line, or to change the color, or to get characteristics that are beneficial from one plant to another. And we see that kind of selective breeding going on. And through that selective breeding, we're able to change certain characteristics, and we understand that. And yet we don't expect to be able to take a wheat stalk and turn it into an oak tree. That goes beyond the capabilities of what's being discussed here. Yeah, Rick? Okay. Yeah. Well, this is the third day. Yeah. Rick is suggesting that the text alludes to a rapid development, a rapid deployment of these plants, and I think I agree with him that's what's being discussed here. That the plants have to proceed. We're going to talk about that in a minute, because we're going to talk about the sort of what we know of the biological requirements of an ecosystem. And part of the bio requirements of an ecosystem require that balance between plant and animal, and we'll discuss that in a moment. We get then into the next few verses, verse 14, and we see here, verse 14, then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of heavens, to separate the day from the night, and let them be for a sign, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens, to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. And God placed them in the expanse of the heavens, and gave light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Again, you're going back to this particular line of reasoning or particular theory that has suggested that the sun exists at this point, already exists. That here it is confirming, yes, God created them, but they are undergoing formation as the earth did. The emphasis, and the commentators will point to the emphasis of these verses on the use of these celestial bodies for the measurement of time. Notice their purposes: to distinguish night from day, to provide signs and seasons, and to illuminate the earth. That's the purpose of these celestial bodies. They would also draw our attention to verse 17. It says that God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, which suggests that they were not yet in position. They existed, but were not yet in position prior to this event. And so it gives some idea, some structure then to that theory along that. Yeah, Rick, another comment? Yes. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. That's an interesting thought that I had not considered. There are other commentators, though, by the way, other commentators have taken on something of this discussion to suggest that time is somewhat indistinct, or time is somewhat undefined. To call it that way, time is undefined prior to this day. This was the purpose of the celestial bodies. The celestial bodies, by God's rule, define time, and until they are put into position, that time is undefined. And so they again back up to the argument, and Rick has made the point here that it may have been that these plants developed very rapidly. You kind of think of some kind of a stop motion film or something where these plants are coming up out of the ground in a rapid succession. The point is that there is some thought that by establishing what he does here on the fourth day, one of the lines of reasoning, or at least one of the lines of argument, is that now here God is establishing time. He is establishing the concepts of time and putting things in their order, placing things, as it says there in verse 17, and that by placing things, he then establishes that celestial order and now allows time to begin to go forward in the progression that as we would understand it. And so that's just an idea, a concept, and a theory for us to consider. We get down into verse 20 then. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." And God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and morning, a fifth day. And so here is this idea. We see this order of creation. We have plants, and then we have ocean life, and then we have birds. And as I mentioned to you before, we have in mankind's understanding of ecology, of an ecological system, we understand that there are two processes that are going on the earth continually. With plants, there is the function of photosynthesis, and probably some of you can tell me better than that, but I do know that it involves that plants absorb carbon dioxide and convert it into simple sugars or starches, and that then respiration on the part of animals, and animals take in oxygen. Oh, by the way, the plants then emit oxygen. The animals, of course, we know, take in oxygen and emit or respirate carbon dioxide. And so we have that cycle there that goes on. And here is an interesting point to the text of the Bible showing that a support for that understanding of ecology, of that respiration, that combination of respiration and photosynthesis, and that the plants have to be there in order for the animals to be able to live, to have the oxygen to live. We also have in this text, if you notice here in verse 22, here is the first of God's blessing. This is the first time that it talks about God giving a blessing, and he gives a blessing. He blesses the animals that he's created. He blesses these sea creatures and these birds. And what is the blessing? The blessing is in their ability to reproduce. And so reproduction, we understand, is a blessing from God. Be fruitful and multiply. He is his instruction. It is his blessing to his creation. He intends for this creation to continue on, and part of that continuing on is in reproduction. We get down, there's a whole lot of question about the origin of life and so forth. It's really hard to know how to condense this down. It's really hard to know what you might want to hear about any of it. I decided to kind of go briefly on it to talk about some of the ideas that have been around. Of course, we understand some of the debate that's been going on about the origin of life and the development of life on Earth. Of course, most of that has been structured around Darwinic evolution or neo-Darwinic evolution that has been postulated for a number of years now. This now has come under, that theory has come under some significant challenges in recent years, fairly recent years, with the concept of irreducible complexity. And what is meant by that? Well, as a thought about that, as we look at life on the earth, we find certain biochemical, even microbiological components that simply do not support the idea of gradual development. They simply do not support them. And why are they not supported? Well, because of this concept of irreducible complexity in design. What do we mean by that? Well, if we look at a mousetrap, for example, if you look at a mousetrap, you've got parts on a mousetrap. In this case, we've got 5 parts on this mousetrap: a spring, a hammer, a holding bar, a catch, and a platform. Well, if we think about that, if any one of those parts is gone, this thing doesn't work. It doesn't do its function. Now, if we remove the spring, it doesn't work. If we remove the catch, it doesn't work. The hammer, it doesn't do anything. And so here we have this mousetrap that is designed for a function. It's designed for a particular job. But if you take any one of the parts away, it doesn't work. Okay? And we understand that. We understand that in human design of machines and so forth. And obviously, this is a simple machine. And so we understand that. We look then at we have seen now, because of our advances in understanding of biochemical science or biological sciences and of microbiology and other facets, we have seen something similar take place within living structures. Here is, for example, this is it's maybe hard to see. I apologize for that, but maybe hard to see, but this is the structure for a flagellum on a type of bacteria called an E. coli. Okay, these E. coli are able to move within a liquid by moving a flagellum, which is simply a kind of a long hair-like structure, and they whip it around and they're able to move within a liquid. Okay, well, how does that work? Well, we've got parts here. We've got this, what's called this flagellar filament, kind of that hair-like structure, but it's connected to this, and this is a biochemical process here with within the cell. The E. coli is a single-celled organism, and you have this outer membrane, you have an inner membrane, you have what they call essentially a rotor, stator, and bearing structures. All of these are protein structures that allow that first of all allow this filament to move by creating electrical imbalances, and because they can create electrical imbalances, it works like an electric motor to some degree. And so this thing will spin, and then it's got another set of proteins that acts as bearings that allows it to spin freely. And all of this, by the way, all of these components you see have to be there in order for this filament to be able to spin and to propel this living organism, this E. coli living organism. And so when we think about the argument goes that if we think about the theory of evolution, Darwinic evolution suggests that this structure would have arisen gradually through successive generations of E. coli, each one, not necessarily each one, but over a long enough period of time, these structures would have developed one after the other or in some particular pattern. And then suddenly here came a creature that had all of the pieces in place, and now this rotor is able to run and drive the flagellum, and suddenly this particular organism has a survival advantage, and because it has a survival advantage, then it's able to reproduce better than its competitors. All right? Well, again, you look at this and you're saying all of these pieces, though, have to fall into place, and they all have to be in place or the thing doesn't work. So what we have to understand is that the theory would require that our bodies or that living organisms are perhaps constantly producing useless structures in the hopes that, or well, not in the hopes, but in the off chance that enough of these useless structures will come together and create something that is useful. That has to be the thought behind it. Or the counter argument is no, these structures existed for another reason, and then they started working in a particular way in a different structure to give it an advantage. To be blunt, it's far-fetched. It really is far-fetched to imagine that these structures are going to just arise spontaneously, and that if we just kind of keep throwing, it's like throwing parts together in a box. You're going to throw a bunch of gears and a bunch of springs and a bunch of parts together in a box. And if you shake the box enough times, ultimately, when you open the lid of the box, there's a watch sitting there running. It's almost like that kind of an idea. that if you just shake the box hard enough and long enough, why all those parts will assemble themselves into a running watch. It just kind of goes contrary to logic, and it kind of goes contrary to our own experience in life. Things just don't randomly come together, for in some kind of improvement spontaneously. It just doesn't happen. Yeah.
The example of mousetrap is conceptually easier for 99.9% of the population to follow. Oh, well, yeah, if you're missing that platform, that mousetrap is not going to do anything good.
Right.
We talk about the biological aspects of the cells and their details, and the DNA and chemistry and all that kind of stuff. Nearly just about everybody is just kind of like, well, I don't understand it.
Right.
And it's a whole lot easier for the Darwinians to say, well, this did develop in stages, and give an example of micropore and stuff like that, and say, see, there are logical steps that can result in this process. And it kind of seems okay, but it kind of seems okay mostly because you really don't understand what's going on.
Right.
The details to actually enact the kind of changes that would be involved there, and to be survivable, and to have a evolutionary advantage to preserve that structure as it's being developed. It's just as impossible as that mousetrap without the platform.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the evolutionists, they'll show you the mousetrap, and they'll take away pieces and say, this wouldn't be a very good mousetrap, but it would still be able to catch them. And if you look at it, you say, no, that wouldn't catch a single mouse.
Right.
Because you can tell, their best example they can try to come with a 4-part mousetrap out at 4 out of 5, it just wouldn't work. And that's obvious to you. They're hating the Whereas in the biological thing, well, you think that you may be more easily convinced that it's been disproven or debunked by not being able to understand all the actual details associated.
And that's a good point. Is that they being the Darwinists, the Darwinists, the evolutionists are going to be relying very heavily on on general population's ignorance of biological processes to try and push their arguments forward. And of course, anyone who disagrees with them they will discredit to the extent that they can. One of the proponents of this, one of the early proponents of this, was Michael Behe. He's a professor of biochemistry, I believe, at Philadelphia, some university in Philadelphia, if I remember right. And the argument there is that they will. The argument is that, well, he misrepresents other people's studies in order to go forward, and what have you. Another fellow that's questioned this to a large extent is a fellow named of Phil Johnson, who is actually a lawyer. Came out with a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And he examined this same attribute, suggesting that if we were to try and see, and if the argument is that these structures are arising out of in living organisms over time, that various structures will arise, that he presumes logically that there must be some intermediate steps then that go from an organism that has no structure at all to an organism that has sort of the final structure. And if that is the case, then there must be intermediate steps. If there are intermediate steps, then how is it that these intermediate steps, surely some of them must be anti-survival enhancing? If I have an E. coli, for example, that has the flagellum and the stator and the rotor, but no bearing, and so that it spins but then freezes after a period of time. Now what do I do? Is that not survival? Yeah, John? Correct.
But the point is, they all have a bill.
Yes.
You can start with no bill. So when you find it developed, they were all, in other words, it was a different type of evolution. It was an evolution that you and I didn't say.
It's microevolution. It's adaptability of species, and it does suggest that and what it does demonstrate is that within the DNA of a living organism, there's a certain plasticity to be able to adapt to environment. But the evolutionists then suggest that there is essentially infinite plasticity. That given enough time, I could take an earthworm and turn it into a dog, or turn it or grow a dog, or grow a cow. That there's that infinite plasticity, whereas most of us would accept a certain a certain limited plasticity, and if we want to look, we need to look no further than dog breeding. If you look at the variety of dogs, every one of those dogs, varieties of dogs that are on the earth, they're all from the same species, Canis familiaris. Every last one of those dogs from the same species, and yet compare, for example, a Chihuahua to a Great Dane. Both of them are dogs. Both of them even of the same species, but if they were, I would suggest to you, if they were found in the wild, they would be different species, simply because that's the way man classifies animals. But because they are of a known breeding line, why? Oh no, we're not going to classify them in different species. But the fact of the matter is, you see the plasticity. But why don't we have, for example, a 2,000-pound dog? Why haven't we bred a 2,000-pound dog that we could, ride around like a horse? And may I suggest to you, it's because there are limits on how big a dog can get. There are limits within the DNA on how big a dog can get, and you're stopped. Yes, John.
I believe that's true. I believe you could if you wanted to breed a 2,000-pound dog. Nobody wants to do that.
Well, yes, Rita. Yes.
But now we have to define a lot of these devices where we can go in now we can acknowledge that there are different places now. It's not the smallest thing.
Right.
Within time, so it's always different.
Yeah.
It's just that we are beginning to find these things.
Yeah, we're just beginning to find it. That's why he called his book, he called it Darwin's Black Box, because what he was referring to there was the cell. Because in Darwin's day, the cell was nothing more than a blob of protoplasm. That's all they could tell. That's all they could see, was just a blob of protoplasm, structure undefined. And it isn't until now, more modern day, we've begun to explore the structures even within the cell and found a tremendous organization and a tremendous structure there of biological, biochemical reactions that take place of literally machines within the, or machine-like functions within the cell itself, taking place on the biochemical level, at the molecular level, that are just astounding. All right, I'm going to stop there. We'll continue this next week, maybe get into a little more of it if we get a chance, but we'll continue on next week. I appreciate your attention this morning and your comments.